5 years ago, I finished a piece of work that I was genuinely proud of. It was a small coffee table made of American walnut, a dense, beautiful wood that usually rewards every hour you spend on it. I spent 3 weeks in my workshop on that piece. I remember the smell of the shavings and the way the grains seemed to dance under the shop lights. I sanded that tabletop down to 320 grit, progressing through every single stage with clinical precision. By the time I was done, the wood felt cold and smooth to the touch, almost like polished plastic or a sheet of glass. I applied Danish oil, 3 coats, with a full 24-hour drying period between each, exactly as the instructions on the tin dictated. The result looked like a textbook example of fine craftsmanship, an even, deep tone, and a soft, silky luster that caught the sidelight perfectly. I handed the table over to the client, feeling absolutely confident that I had created something that would last for decades. 18 months later, I received a message on my phone with a single photograph. It was my table, but I didn't recognize it. The surface looked as if it had never been finished at all. The oil hadn't peeled off in flakes, and it hadn't cracked the way a cheap hardware store varnish might. It had simply vanished, leaving behind dry, matte, dead-looking timber. In the areas where the table was used most, under books, where coffee mugs had sat, the walnut had paled to the color of old, sun-bleached shipping cardboard. I drove to the client's house, picked up the table, and brought it back to my shop. I sat in front of it in the silence for a long time, trying to understand where I had failed. The wood itself was fine, the structure was sound, and there was no physical damage. The finish simply hadn't stayed. That same month, I happened to be in a restoration workshop in Yaroslavl, visiting an old master who specialized in 15th and 16th century estate furniture. On his workbench was a walnut panel from the late 1400s. It had an incredibly deep, living glow, a luster that seemed to come from within the wood itself rather than sitting on top of it like a film. I leaned in close and touched it. The tactile sensation was entirely different from my 320 grit plastic finish. It felt like wood, but refined to an impossible degree. I asked him how the piece had maintained that appearance after 5 centuries of varying humidity and neglect. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at my hands, then at the stack of sandpaper sticking out of my tool bag, and said quite simply, "The finish only holds where the surface is prepared correctly. You, most likely, are a sander." He said it without a hint of judgment, just as a technical statement of fact. For the next 2 hours, he explained what sandpaper actually does to wood fibers and why what we consider perfect preparation is actually the fundamental destruction of the material's structure. Today, I'm going to share everything I learned that day and what I've spent the last 4 years verifying in my own practice. We're going to look at the mechanics of what happens to a wood fiber the moment an abrasive grain passes over it, and why that creates a barrier that no oil or varnish can truly penetrate. I'll show you a method of surface preparation that was the standard for centuries before sandpaper became a cheap industrial substitute. You'll see how to transition to this method in a modern home workshop using only a hand plane and a scraper, and what this change will do for your work's longevity. And at the very end, I'll show you a final finishing trick that the Yaroslavl master demonstrated to me, a small mechanical nuance that completely changes the optics of the wood. To understand why sanding is the enemy, we have to look at the level of the individual cell, at a scale the human eye can't see. There is a massive gap between what we think we are doing when we sand and what is actually happening. When you push a random orbital sander across a board, the abrasive grains, usually aluminum oxide or silicon carbide, act like microscopic hooks. They don't cut the fibers, they tear, crush, and fold them. Research from the University of Helsinki's Department of Forest Products describes this as the destroyed layer. It's a zone between 30 and 80 microns thick, where the natural capillaries of the wood are completely blocked by fragments of their own cell walls and fine dust that is pressurized and vibrated into the pores. In my own tests, I found that the penetration depth of pure linseed oil on a sanded oak board is reduced by 35% compared to a surface processed with a sharp hand plane. On walnut, that figure jumps to 45%. The sanded wood simply refuses to let the finish in. The oil doesn't settle into the cell structure. It sits on a loose cushion of mangled fibers and dust. For the first few months, you won't notice, but the destroyed layer is unstable. As soon as the wood begins its natural cycle of expansion and contraction due to humidity, those crushed fibers try to straighten out. As they do, they literally eject the finish, molecule by molecule. That is exactly what happened to my table 5 years ago. It wasn't the oil's fault. I had effectively sealed the wood against its own protection before the first drop of finish ever touched the surface. Today, we're going to fix that. When I stood in that restoration workshop, I was surrounded by a scent that is impossible to mistake for anything else. A heavy, grounding mix of boiled linseed oil, ancient bone glue, and wood that had been air drying for centuries. On the workbenches lay furniture components from the late 15th century, an era where a master couldn't simply walk into a store and buy a multi-pack of abrasive sheets. Mass production of paper-backed abrasives didn't truly take hold until the mid-19th century. Before that point, every joiner, cabinet maker, and carriage builder solved the problem of surface smoothness through the use of hardened steel. And it is precisely in this technical limitation that the secret of the longevity we see in museum collections is hidden. The masters of the past worked in what we would now consider extreme engineering conditions. Traditional wooden estates with masonry stove heating meant constant, violent swings in temperature and humidity. In the summer, the wood would swell with the dampness of the river air. In the winter, the heat of the stove would dry it until the joinery rang like bone. Any finish that simply sat on top of the wood, a surface film, would have delaminated and peeled away within 2 or 3 seasons. For furniture to survive through generations, the finish had to become an integral part of the wood itself, penetrating the cellular structure to the maximum possible depth. The restorer showed me a mid-19th century German apprentice manual. There wasn't a single word in there about sanding as a method for preparing a surface for lacquering. Training began with sharpening. An apprentice spent 7 years learning the trade, not because the work was slow, but because his hands had to learn to feel a difference of 0.5 millimeter when adjusting the frog or the iron of a plane. The central philosophy was simple. A surface must be cut, never rubbed. This is the fundamental piece of the old school that we have lost in the noise of industrialization. At the heart of this was an understanding of wood not as a solid uniform block, but as a complex system of hollow capillary tubes. When you work with a razor-sharp hand plane, you are acting as a surgeon with a scalpel. The edge of the tool shears through the cell walls with a clean surgical strike, leaving the mouths of those capillaries wide open. This allows oil or wax to flow deep into the structure, sometimes up to 2 or 3 millimeters, effectively sealing the wood from the inside out. The tragedy of the modern workshop is that we have become hostages to speed. The industry sold us sandpaper as a fast track to a professional result, but it never mentioned the hidden cost of that convenience. I spent 20 years believing that the progression from 80 grit to 320 grit was the definitive path to quality. In reality, it is a path toward creating a hermetic plug made of wood dust and mangled fibers. We have learned to rely on powerful modern finishes, polyurethanes and acrylics, that create a thick plastic film. This film holds onto itself through its own internal strength, not because it is truly bonded to the wood. It masks the problem of poor preparation until the exact moment moisture finds a way through a microcrack. Then, the coating begins to lift in sheets because, underneath it, there is that destroyed layer the master spoke of. I remember him taking an old cabinet scraper, making 2 effortless passes over a piece of 100-year-old oak, and handing me the shaving. It was transparent, like a sliver of onion skin, and it smelled of fresh timber even after a century. He said, "Look, the wood under this crust is still alive. It is ready to accept protection. But your sandpaper? It only hammers the filth deeper into the grain." In that moment, it hit me that all my skill in sanding was just a way to make wood look like plastic, while simultaneously stripping it of its ability to resist the passage of time. Returning to hand tools today isn't a rejection of progress. It's a return to an honest quality that doesn't require a fresh coat of maintenance every 12 months. It's about letting the physics of the material dictate the rules of the craft. Now we move from the why to the how. If you, like me 4 years ago, have spent your entire career leaning on a random orbital sander and a pack of discs, Making the switch to hand tools can feel like a step into the unknown. But it is the only way to stop violating the wood and start collaborating with it. In my workshop, I've distilled this process into 3 primary stages of preparation that completely replace hours of dusty, vibrating sanding. The first and most critical stage is working with a dedicated smoothing plane. For final surface preparation, I reach for a number 4 smoothing plane. It's a classic American standard, but the secret isn't in the brand, it's in how you prepare the iron. Most factory blades are ground to a functional edge, which is nowhere near enough for a finish-ready surface. I take my iron to the Waterstones and sharpen it up to a 6,000 grit finish. I maintain the primary bevel at 25 degrees, and at the very tip, I hone a micro bevel at 30 degrees. This specific geometry gives the cutting edge the necessary rigidity so it doesn't deflect or chatter when it hits the harder late wood of the growth rings. But there is one nuance that separates a woodworker from a sander, the camber. This is a very slight, almost imperceptible curve across the width of the blade's edge, about 0.5 millimeters, roughly 0.02 inches, from the center to the corners. You don't want a flat edge. If the blade is perfectly flat, the corners will dig in and leave tracks or steps in the wood that are a nightmare to remove. When I first tuned my plane this way and took a pass on a slab of American walnut, I actually stopped and stared. A shaving came out from under the sole that was thinner and more transparent than a piece of cigarette paper. The surface left behind didn't just look smooth, it shone as if it had already been varnished. This is what we call clean severance. While modern abrasives work on the principle of friction and tearing, the plane works like a scalpel. I set the depth of cut to the absolute minimum, just a few microns. If the shaving is brittle or breaks, either your iron is dull or your cut is too deep. However, wood isn't always cooperative. On highly figured woods, like curly walnut, bird's eye maple, or quarter-sawn white oak, where the fibers constantly change direction, a standard 45-degree plane will often tear out the grain, leaving jagged pits. This is where most people give up and go back to the sander. The old-world solution I learned is to increase the angle of attack. If the standard frog angle is 45 degrees, I'll switch to a high-angle frog of 50 or even 55 degrees. By increasing the angle, the blade acts more like a scraper than a wedge. It breaks the fiber immediately after it's cut, preventing the wood from splitting ahead of the blade. It takes more physical effort to push, but the result on difficult grain is flawless. The second stage is the use of the card scraper. Many people think of a scraper as a piece of sheet metal that you drag across wood to get rid of glue, but in the hands of a master, it is a tool of surgical precision. I prefer a scraper plate that is about 0.7 to 0.8 millimeters thick. The entire secret of the scraper lies in the burr, or the hook. A common mistake is thinking the scraper should just scrape dust. If you're getting dust, you're just sanding with a piece of metal. You want micro shavings. To get them, I first draw file the edge of the scraper perfectly flat at 90 degrees, then hone that edge on a stone until it's a mirror finish. Then comes the critical part, turning the hook. I take a polished steel burnisher, a tool harder than the scraper itself, and with firm, consistent pressure, I stroke the edge at an angle of about 10 to 15 degrees. After just 3 or 4 passes, you can feel a tiny microscopic hook of metal that has been pushed over the edge. When you use it, you slightly bend the scraper with your thumbs to create a curve and push it into the wood at a 20-degree angle. I remember the first time I did this after the Yaroslavl trip. After 10 minutes of work, the walnut felt warmer and deeper than it ever had after an hour of sanding. This happens because the scraper removes the microscopic ridges left by the plane while keeping every single pore wide open. It doesn't burnish the wood closed, it slices the high points off. The third stage is the moment of truth, the verification and the oiling. Your hand can be easily fooled by the slickness of dust, so I use raking light. I place a high-powered flashlight or a shop lamp almost parallel to the tabletop. In this low, side-angled light, every missed fiber, every micro-tear, and every imperfection casts a long, dramatic shadow. Only when the board looks perfectly clean under raking light do I reach for the finish. I decided to run a controlled experiment to prove this to myself. I took a single board of black walnut and marked a line down the center. On the left side, I sanded from 80 grit up to 320, following every proper modern rule. On the right side, I used only my number 4 plane and a card scraper. Then I applied pure, natural tung oil to both sides. The difference wasn't visible in a year, it was visible in 5 seconds. On the sanded side, the oil sat in a puddle. It struggled to penetrate the destroyed layer of dust-clogged pores. I had to physically rub it in to get it to move. On the plain side, the oil disappeared into the wood almost instantly. It was as if the wood was drinking the finish. After 30 minutes, I wiped away the excess. The plain side had an incredible optical depth, an effect called chatoyancy, where the wood seems to glow from within. This is because the clean-cut cell walls act like millions of microscopic mirrors, reflecting light from deep within the wood structure. On the sanded side, the light was simply scattered by the mangled, fuzzy fibers, making the walnut look flat, muddy, and dead. The next day, I tested the surface hardness with a stylus. On the sanded half, the stylus left a clear, deep groove because the oil had only formed a thin, brittle film on the surface. On the planed half, the mark was barely visible. Because the oil had penetrated deep into the open capillaries, it had polymerized inside the wood, reinforcing the cellular structure itself. We spend weeks building a piece of furniture, then we save 2 hours by using sandpaper, and in doing so, we compromise the next 50 years of that piece's life. That is the fundamental trade-off we make when we choose industrial convenience over craft. Over the years, I've realized that the greatest barrier to mastering a craft isn't the lack of a specific tool or a physical skill, it's the mental baggage we carry into the workshop. Our thinking is cluttered with industrial-age shortcuts that we've mistaken for fundamental truths. To truly move away from the sanding trap, we have to dismantle 5 specific patterns of thinking that most of us have been taught to accept without question. The first pattern is the belief that sandpaper is an essential final step. We treat it like a rite of passage for every project. But if you look at the history of the trade, sandpaper wasn't invented to improve quality, it was invented to standardize output. In a factory setting where you have one master overseeing 100 semi-skilled laborers, you cannot teach everyone to sharpen and use a smoothing plane to a master's level. It takes too long. Sandpaper allowed the industry to achieve a good enough surface using unskilled labor. We've taken an industrial crutch and turned it into our gold standard. For years, I felt like I hadn't finished a piece unless I had spent 3 hours under a dust mask vibrating my hands into numbness. Now, I see that time as a wasted opportunity to actually interact with the material. The second error is the grit infinity myth. I see woodworkers on forums bragging about sanding a tabletop to 600, 800, or even 1,000 grit. They believe that higher numbers equal higher quality. In reality, the opposite is true for the longevity of the finish. The finer the abrasive, the more effective it is at creating that destroyed layer I mentioned earlier. At 600 grit, you aren't just smoothing the wood, you are creating an impenetrable shield of microscopic wood flour and crushed cells. You are effectively burnishing the wood shut with its own waste. When you apply oil to a surface like that, it has nowhere to go. It sits on top, oxidizes into a thin, fragile film, and eventually fails when the wood moves. You've traded 50 years of durability for 5 minutes of feeling like a piece of plastic. The third pattern is the ritual of raising the grain. We've all done it. We sand, we wipe the wood with a damp cloth, we wait for the fibers to stand up like tiny needles, and then we sand them off again. We think of this as a necessary technical step. But when you work with a sharp plane, there is no grain to raise. The reason grain pops after sanding is that the abrasive has mangled and bent the fibers into the surface. The water simply allows those bent, stressed fibers to relax and spring back up. If you cut the fiber cleanly with steel, the cell wall is severed, not crushed. There is no internal tension left to cause that fuzz. I stopped raising the grain 4 years ago because, on a plain surface, the grain simply stays where it is. The fourth pattern is trusting our sense of touch over our eyes. Fingers are easily deceived by the lack of friction that dust provides. A sanded surface feels soft because you are feeling a layer of microscopic fuzzy debris. A plain surface feels hard and cool. This is because you are touching the actual solid structure of the wood, not a cushion of dust. A master doesn't just feel for smoothness, he looks for clarity. The difference between a sanded board and a planed board is the difference between looking through a frosted bathroom window and a piece of high-end optical glass. One scatters the light, the other lets it pass through to reveal the depth of the grain. The fifth and perhaps most damaging pattern is the fear of the tool itself. We are told that sharpening and using a hand plane is a lost art that takes a lifetime to master. This is a myth perpetuated by companies that want to sell you more sandpaper and more power tools. In my experience training apprentices, it takes exactly 2 weeks of focused practice to learn how to sharpen an iron and set a plane for a finish cut. That's a one-time investment of time that pays dividends on every single project you will ever build. It's the difference between being a consumer of abrasives and a master of your material. Now, as promised, I want to share the bonus technique that the Yaroslavl master showed me. He called it bone compaction, or burnishing with the grain. This is the step that happens after the scraper but before the first drop of oil. He took a piece of highly polished, dense cow bone. I've since found that a block of ultra-dense boxwood or a polished stainless steel rod works just as well. He rubbed the tool along the grain with significant pressure. He wasn't removing material, he was compacting the uppermost layer of the cell walls. Mechanically, this does something incredible. It increases the surface density and the light reflection coefficient without clogging the pores with dust. It gives the wood a natural, glassy sheen that comes from the fiber itself. When you apply oil after this compaction, the oil still flows into the open capillaries, but the surface remains incredibly resilient to dents and scratches. I use this method on every high-touch area: the arms of a chair, the edge of a table, the handle of a tool. It creates a museum glow that no amount of chemical polish can replicate. That walnut coffee table I started this story with, I eventually got it back from the client. I stripped off the failed finish, but I didn't reach for the sandpaper this time. I used a number 4 plane to take off the dead layer, followed by a card scraper to refine the figure. I burnished it with a boxwood block and applied simple, pure linseed oil and beeswax. That was 4 years ago. That table has lived through 2 children, spilled drinks, and the dry heat of a modern American home. It hasn't paled. It hasn't died. In fact, it looks better today than the day I returned it. It has developed a patina, a deep, honey-like warmth that only happens when the finish and the wood are truly one. In the end, our craft isn't just about the objects we make. It's about the relationship we have with the material. We can choose to fight the wood with abrasives, trying to force it into a shape that mimics plastic. Or we can return to the physics of the material, to the methods that respect the fiber and the cell. The old masters knew that steel and wood speak the same language. Sandpaper is just a scream that drowns out the conversation. The next time you reach for a sanding block, I want you to stop for a second and think about those open pores. Maybe that's the moment your own path toward real quality begins.